Wait, don't walk away yet. The little girl's voice floated through the cold evening air so softly that it should have disappeared beneath the rumble of buses, the distant wail of sirens, and the restless heartbeat of downtown Chicago. Instead, it stopped a billionaire in the middle of his stride. Nathaniel Brooks had spent 23 years believing every important sound came with a price tag. The ringing of the New York Stock Exchange had once changed his future. The vibration of a private phone meant another acquisition worth hundreds of millions. Even applause at charity galas had become little more than polished background noise. But this voice carried something money had never been able to buy. He slowly turned toward the small public square across from the train station, where Christmas lights shimmered between bare maple trees and reflected across patches of melting snow. Office workers hurried home, with paper coffee cups warming their hands. Tourists laughed beneath glowing storefront windows. Street musicians packed away guitars before the temperature dropped below freezing. Yet almost no one noticed the little girl sitting quietly on an old wooden bench beside a weathered brick fountain. She couldn't have been older than 8. Her dark curls were gathered into neat braids beneath a knitted navy cap that had clearly been repaired more than once. A faded green scarf wrapped carefully around her neck, and an oversized winter coat hung loosely from her shoulders as though it had once belonged to someone much taller. Beside her rested a worn backpack, stitched carefully at the corners with blue thread, and curled beneath a folded blanket slept a little boy no older than 4, breathing peacefully despite the chilly evening. The girl wasn't performing for spare change. There was no open guitar case, no cardboard sign asking for help, no plastic cup waiting for coins. She simply sang. Her voice drifted gently through the square with remarkable warmth, carrying a melody so pure that conversations seemed to soften without anyone realizing why. Nathaniel stood perfectly still. He had attended Broadway premieres, private concerts, and exclusive charity performances by Grammy-winning artists. Yet none of those memories reached into his chest the way this simple lullaby did. It wasn't flawless. It wasn't polished. It was honest. Every note felt like it belonged to someone she loved more than herself. He found himself taking one slow step closer, then another, careful not to interrupt whatever invisible thread connected the child to the song. The melody wasn't familiar. His mind searched for the title, but found nothing. No hymn, no Christmas classic, no folk tune he had ever heard. It sounded like a song that existed only for this little corner of the world. As the final note lingered in the frosty air, the girl smiled, not toward the gathering crowd, but toward the sleeping boy beside her. She gently tucked the blanket higher beneath his chin before whispering almost too quietly for anyone else to hear. Mom said songs keep people warm, even when winter forgets about them. Nathaniel felt something inside him shift, subtle enough that no one passing by could have noticed. For the first time in years, his schedule no longer mattered. The driver waiting with the black sedan across the street no longer mattered. The dinner meeting with investors no longer mattered. Only one question echoed inside his mind as he looked at the little girl whose voice had somehow stopped the busiest man in the city. If no one was listening to her before tonight, then who had she been singing to all this time? Nathaniel remained where he was long after the last note had disappeared into the winter air. Around him, the city continued moving with practiced indifference. Taxi horns echoed through the streets. Commuters hurried toward the train platforms, and bright holiday displays reflected across polished office windows. Yet the small bench beside the fountain seemed untouched by the rush of the world. The little girl adjusted the faded green scarf around the sleeping boy and quietly rubbed warmth back into his tiny hands before reaching into her worn backpack. She removed a neatly folded paper bag, opened it carefully, and smiled when she found a single turkey sandwich wrapped inside. Nathaniel watched as she divided it with remarkable precision. She gave the larger half to the little boy, gently setting it beside him so it would be ready when he woke up. The smaller half she wrapped again and slipped back into the bag without taking a single bite. She stood, brushed a few snowflakes from her coat, and walked toward a gray-haired man sitting alone beneath a nearby street lamp. His jacket was thin, his hands hidden deep inside worn gloves, and his eyes remained fixed on the sidewalk. Without saying anything dramatic, the little girl simply offered him the wrapped sandwich. The man looked surprised. He hesitated before accepting it with both hands, his grateful smile saying far more than words ever could. She answered with a quiet nod, then returned to the bench as though sharing her dinner had been the most ordinary thing in the world. Nathaniel realized she had given away the only food she had kept for herself. His chest tightened in a way that quarterly earnings reports and boardroom victories had never managed to accomplish. He crossed the square slowly, careful not to startle her. She looked up the moment his polished shoes stopped a respectful distance from the bench. Her brown eyes were calm, observant, and far older than they should have been. "You have an incredible voice," Nathaniel said gently. "Thank you, sir," she replied with a small smile. "Did someone teach you to sing?" She glanced down at the sleeping boy before answering. "My mother did." Her words carried warmth instead of sadness, as though the memory itself was still alive beside her. Nathaniel reached into his coat pocket and removed his wallet. He pulled out several crisp $100 bills, holding them toward her. "Please," he said, "use this for dinner, a hotel, anything you need tonight." The girl looked at the money only briefly before shaking her head. "Thank you, sir, but I cannot take that." Nathaniel blinked, convinced she had misunderstood. "It is a gift." She smiled politely. "I know it is, but gifts like that sometimes disappear too quickly. If you really want to help us, there is a family grocery store 2 blocks away. They know my little brother likes warm milk before he sleeps. Could you buy milk and some bread instead?" Nathaniel lowered his hand, surprised by the quiet confidence in her answer. "You trust the store more than cash." She nodded. "Food keeps us going. Money makes people ask questions that I cannot always answer." Nathaniel had negotiated billion-dollar agreements with seasoned executives who never spoke as honestly as this child. Before he could respond, the little boy stirred beneath the blanket and slowly opened his eyes. The girl immediately knelt beside him, smiling as though the cold no longer existed. "Good evening, Isaiah," she whispered. "I saved your favorite part." The boy looked around sleepily before wrapping his arms around her. "Did you sing again?" he asked. "Just a little," she answered. "Did anybody clap?" She laughed softly and brushed a snowflake from his cheek. "No, but somebody listened." Isaiah accepted the paper bag with both hands as though it contained something far more valuable than bread and warm milk. He smiled at his sister before carefully taking a small bite, and Amara waited until she saw him eating before she reached for the carton of milk Nathaniel had quietly purchased from the neighborhood grocery store only minutes earlier. She thanked him with a simple nod instead of excitement, as though gratitude had become a daily habit rather than a performance. Nathaniel remained beside the bench, unsure why he had canceled the dinner reservation his assistant had spent weeks arranging. His phone vibrated inside his coat pocket for what must have been the 10th time that evening, but he ignored it without looking at the screen. For the first time in years, another meeting no longer seemed urgent. Across the square, families laughed beneath strings of white lights while children pointed excitedly toward the enormous Christmas tree standing at the center of the plaza. Amara watched them for a moment, her expression peaceful rather than envious. She turned toward Isaiah and quietly buttoned the top of his oversized coat before pulling his knit cap lower over his ears. "You always make sure he is warm before yourself," Nathaniel observed. Amara smiled gently. "He is still growing. I have had more winters than he has." The answer lingered in Nathaniel's mind. It sounded less like something an 8-year-old would invent and more like wisdom carefully borrowed from someone she deeply loved. After Isaiah finished drinking his milk, Amara folded the empty paper bag with remarkable care and tucked it into her backpack instead of throwing it away. Nathaniel noticed that every possession she owned seemed to have a purpose. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was taken for granted. As they prepared to leave the bench, Isaiah pointed toward the fountain where several pennies glittered beneath the shallow water. "Can we make a wish?" he asked hopefully. Amara shook her head with a warm smile. Those belonged to someone else's hope. Instead, she reached into her pocket and removed a single nickel that had become smooth around the edges with age. She placed it into Isaiah's mitten. "Keep this until you earn your own lucky coin," she whispered. "Then give this one to somebody who needs hope more than we do." Nathaniel watched silently, unable to remember the last meaningful lesson he had heard inside any corporate boardroom. They began walking toward the covered walkway beside the train station, and Nathaniel followed several steps behind without announcing himself. He expected them to disappear into one of the crowded shelters nearby, But they continued farther until they reached a quiet corner beneath an old stone overpass. Hidden neatly behind a row of evergreen shrubs stood a small weatherproof storage container, 2 carefully folded blankets, several books protected inside plastic sleeves, and a battery-powered lantern casting a soft golden glow. The space was humble, but it was spotless. Every item had been organized with care and quiet dignity. Isaiah immediately sat down beside the lantern and opened one of the books with visible excitement. Amara smiled proudly before beginning to hum the same unfamiliar melody Nathaniel had heard earlier that evening while she straightened the blankets. He remained hidden behind the shadows, realizing something that unsettled him more than any financial crisis ever had. These children had almost nothing, yet every small corner of their world reflected patience, gratitude, and purpose. Then his eyes settled on a weathered wooden box tucked carefully beneath one folded blanket. Amara lifted it with extraordinary gentleness, almost as though she were holding a family treasure instead of an ordinary container. And for the briefest moment, Nathaniel caught sight of yellowed sheet music resting inside before she quietly closed the lid again. The sight of the weathered wooden box stayed with Nathaniel long after Amara tucked it carefully beneath the folded blanket again. She treated it with the same quiet respect that other families reserved for treasured heirlooms. Isaiah had already curled beneath the blankets with his book resting open across his lap, the battery lantern casting a warm circle of light around the tiny shelter. Snow drifted gently beyond the overpass, muffling the sounds of the city until only the occasional train echoed through the cold night. Nathaniel knew he should leave. His driver had undoubtedly been waiting for more than an hour, and tomorrow's calendar was filled from sunrise until late evening. Yet his feet refused to move. He stepped forward slowly, making sure his shoes scraped lightly against the pavement so he would not surprise them. Amara turned immediately, recognizing him before he spoke. Instead of looking frightened, she offered the same calm smile she had given him in the square. "You followed us," she said softly. Nathaniel nodded, embarrassed by the truth. "I wanted to make sure you both arrived safely." She accepted the explanation without suspicion. "Thank you for caring." Her simple words carried no accusation and no expectation. They sounded sincere enough to make Nathaniel feel unexpectedly uncomfortable. He glanced toward the wooden box. "May I ask what is inside?" Amara rested one hand gently on the lid before answering. "My family's most important things." Nathaniel waited patiently, sensing she would decide how much to share. After a quiet moment, she opened the box just enough for him to see several carefully protected sheets of handwritten music, a small framed photograph of a smiling woman with warm brown eyes, a tiny silver music note charm attached to a worn blue ribbon, and a stack of folded letters tied neatly together with white string. Every page had been wrapped inside clear plastic to protect it from moisture. Nothing looked expensive, yet everything looked priceless. "Your mother's?" Nathaniel asked quietly. Amara nodded. She always said music deserved to stay beautiful, even when life became difficult. Nathaniel studied the handwritten notes. "Did she write these songs?" "Every one of them," Amara answered proudly. "She never recorded them. She said they first belonged to the people who needed hope." Nathaniel looked back toward the photograph. The woman was standing beside an old, upright piano inside what appeared to be a neighborhood church. Her smile radiated the same quiet warmth he had already seen in Amara. "And the song you sang tonight?" he asked. Amara smiled again, this time with unmistakable affection. "That was the last song she ever finished. She taught it to me one line at a time until I could sing it without looking at the paper." Nathaniel searched his memory once more. "I have never heard it before." "Nobody has," Amara replied. "She wanted to sing it someday, but she said the right day never came." A gentle silence settled between them. Isaiah yawned sleepily before closing his book and whispering, "Sing it again tomorrow?" Amara brushed a hand across his forehead. "Tomorrow, and the day after that, too." Nathaniel found himself staring at the handwritten pages inside the box. The melody that had stopped him outside the train station suddenly felt even more mysterious. It had not come from a famous songwriter, a recording studio, or a concert hall. It had traveled from a mother's heart to her daughter, preserved only by memory and love. As Amara carefully closed the lid once more, Nathaniel realized the greatest treasure hidden beneath that overpass was not the wooden box itself. It was the song inside it, waiting patiently for the world to hear its story. When Nathaniel finally returned to his penthouse overlooking the Chicago skyline, the city below glittered like a sea of distant stars, but for the first time in years the view brought him no satisfaction. He loosened his tie, placed his phone on the kitchen counter, and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows with the unfamiliar melody still echoing in his thoughts. He had spent decades solving impossible business problems by gathering facts before making decisions, and this felt no different. Before midnight, he called his longtime executive assistant, Claire Mitchell. She answered almost immediately, surprised to hear his voice so late. "I need your help with something," Nathaniel said. "Not a business acquisition. A family." Claire listened quietly as he described the little girl named Amara, her younger brother Isaiah, the handwritten music, and the song that existed nowhere except inside a weathered wooden box. There was a brief silence before Claire spoke. "Do you want me to contact a charity?" Nathaniel looked out across the city lights and slowly shook his head, even though she could not see him. "No, I want the truth before I decide how to help. Find out who they are, but please do it respectfully. I do not want anyone frightened or embarrassed because of my curiosity." By sunrise, Claire had already begun searching through public records, school enrollment archives, neighborhood outreach organizations, and local church directories. Throughout the morning, she called several community volunteers who had quietly served families in the area for years. Each conversation revealed another small piece of a much larger story. By early afternoon, she arrived at Nathaniel's office carrying a thin folder instead of the thick investigative reports he normally expected. "There is less paperwork than I thought," she admitted. "But everyone remembers them." Nathaniel opened the folder slowly. Inside was a school photograph of Amara taken 2 years earlier. She wore the same gentle smile, though her coat looked newer and her eyes seemed lighter. Another page contained attendance records showing excellent grades before her enrollment unexpectedly ended. There were handwritten notes from a church music director praising her remarkable ear for melody and her willingness to help younger children learn simple songs after Sunday services. Claire continued. Quietly, her mother was named Evelyn Johnson. She volunteered at a neighborhood church and occasionally gave free voice lessons to children whose families could not afford music classes. According to everyone I spoke with, she believed music belonged to everyone. Nathaniel looked again at the photograph of the smiling woman beside the piano. The resemblance between mother and daughter was unmistakable. "What happened after that?" he asked gently. Claire turned another page. "Evelyn became seriously ill several years ago. Before she passed away, she asked friends to help keep the children together if they ever needed support. Unfortunately, circumstances changed faster than anyone expected. Temporary housing arrangements ended, relatives moved away, and the system simply could not provide a permanent solution right away. Several outreach workers have continued checking on them whenever they can, and they all say the same thing." Nathaniel raised his eyes. "What do they say?" Claire smiled softly. "They say Amara never asks strangers for money. If someone offers help, she asks only for groceries, books, or warm clothing for Isaiah. They also say she sings almost every evening at the same public square before taking her brother back to their little shelter." Nathaniel closed the folder with unusual care. Every new answer only deepened the mystery instead of resolving it. There was one final note clipped to the inside cover, written by the church music director in careful blue ink. It read, "Evelyn once told me that one song can outlive the person who writes it, if the right voice refuses to let it disappear." Nathaniel read the sentence twice before quietly looking back toward the winter sky. Somewhere beneath those same clouds, Amara was probably singing again, protecting not only her brother's hope, but a promise she had made to her mother without ever speaking it aloud. The following evening, Nathaniel returned to the public square long before sunset, arriving without a driver, security team, or tailored overcoat that would draw attention. He carried only a simple paper bag from the neighborhood grocery store filled with fresh bread, fruit, warm soup, and 2 new library notebooks. He had spent the entire day thinking about the sentence Claire had read aloud, wondering how a single unfinished song could still be changing lives years after its composer was gone. Snowflakes drifted lazily beneath the glowing streetlights as the city prepared for another cold December night. One by one, familiar sounds filled the square again. The trains arrived on schedule, coffee shops welcomed the evening crowd, and families hurried home with wrapped gifts tucked beneath their arms. Then, almost exactly as the church volunteer had described, Amara appeared with Isaiah walking beside her. She greeted the elderly newspaper vendor with a cheerful smile, waved to the crossing guard who remembered her name, and thanked a bakery employee who handed Isaiah a warm dinner roll that had not been sold that day. Nathaniel quietly realized something remarkable. Although the children possessed very little, they had earned something far more difficult to obtain. They had earned the trust of an entire neighborhood. Amara noticed Nathaniel standing near the fountain and walked over with the same calm confidence she always carried. "Good evening, Mr. Brooks," she said. Nathaniel smiled, surprised that she had remembered his name after hearing it only once. "Good evening, Amara. I brought a few things that I hoped might be useful." She looked inside the paper bag, then smiled warmly. "These are thoughtful gifts. Thank you." Isaiah immediately hugged one of the notebooks against his chest. "Can I draw in this?" he asked excitedly. "It belongs to you now," Nathaniel replied. The little boy's face lit up brighter than the Christmas lights surrounding the square. As Isaiah sat nearby sketching tiny snowmen with the pencil tucked inside the notebook, Nathaniel turned back toward Amara. "May I ask you something?" She nodded. "Why do you always sing in this exact place?" For a moment, she looked toward the empty wooden bench across the fountain before answering. "Because my mother used to sit there after choir practice when she was tired. She said people rushing home needed kindness even if they did not know they were looking for it." Nathaniel followed her gaze. The old bench seemed ordinary to everyone else. Yet to Amara it was a place filled with memories no one else could see. "And the song?" he asked quietly. Amara folded her hands together. "She made me promise something before she went to heaven." Her voice remained steady, but every word carried quiet devotion. "She said that if I ever stopped singing it, the song might disappear forever. She told me that music only stays alive when somebody is willing to share it." Nathaniel felt an unexpected ache behind his eyes. He had assumed the melody was simply a treasured memory. Instead, it had become a promise passed from one generation to the next. Amara looked toward Isaiah, who was proudly showing his drawing to a passing police officer, earning an encouraging smile in return. Then she lowered her voice. "Sometimes I think people believe I sing because I want them to notice me." She shook her head gently. "I sing because I do not want the world to forget her." Nathaniel stood speechless. In that quiet winter evening, surrounded by strangers hurrying toward their own destinations, he finally understood that the greatest performance he had ever witnessed had never been about applause. It had always been about keeping one mother's love alive, one song at a time. Over the next several evenings, Nathaniel returned to the square at the same hour, never announcing his arrival and never trying to interrupt the quiet rhythm that Amara and Isaiah had built together. The children slowly grew comfortable with his presence, not because of his wealth, but because he always listened before he spoke. Sometimes he brought fresh fruit. Other nights he carried library books, warm gloves, or drawing pencils for Isaiah. Every gift had a purpose, and every gift was offered with the same respect Amara had shown when she first refused his money. One afternoon, as Nathaniel sat inside his office reviewing contracts that suddenly felt less important than they once had, an idea quietly settled into his mind. He called Claire and asked her to reserve the small outdoor plaza owned by his foundation for the following Saturday afternoon. It was a place usually used for holiday community events, local choirs, and neighborhood celebrations. "No reporters," Nathaniel said. "No advertisements. No grand announcement. I only want a piano, a microphone, and a few chairs." Claire smiled, already understanding that this event would be unlike any charity program the foundation had ever organized. When Nathaniel visited the children that evening, he waited until Isaiah wandered a few feet away to build a tiny snowman before speaking. "Amara, would you consider singing somewhere different this weekend?" She looked at him with quiet curiosity. "Where?" "At a community gathering," he answered gently. "Nothing formal. Just neighbors sharing music together." She lowered her eyes for a moment. "I have never sung on a stage." Nathaniel smiled warmly. "Neither had your mother, once." Amara looked surprised that he knew so much about Evelyn. "I spoke with people who remembered her," he admitted. "Every one of them described her as someone who believed music should be shared." Amara remained silent, carefully thinking through his invitation instead of answering too quickly. "Would there be many people?" she finally asked. Perhaps a few dozen, Nathaniel replied honestly. Only families, children, and members of the neighborhood. Nothing more. She glanced toward Isaiah, who proudly held up his lopsided snowman, as though it were a masterpiece. A gentle smile appeared across her face. If Isaiah can come with me, then I will sing. Nathaniel nodded immediately. He will have the best seat in the audience. During the days that followed, preparations remained intentionally simple. Volunteers placed evergreen wreaths around the small plaza, local cafes agreed to serve free hot chocolate, and several neighborhood musicians offered to perform before the evening concluded. Nathaniel insisted that Amara's name should not appear on any posters. He wanted people to discover her voice without expectations or introductions. On the morning of the gathering, Amara opened the weathered wooden box beneath the overpass and carefully lifted out the handwritten sheet music. She gently touched the photograph of her mother before tying the tiny silver music note charm around her wrist. With the worn blue ribbon, Isaiah watched quietly before asking, "Are you nervous?" Amara smiled and squeezed his hand. A little. He looked up at her with complete confidence. "Mom always said your songs make people feel like they are home." Amara closed the wooden box with extraordinary care and looked toward the bright winter sky. For the first time since her mother had entrusted her with that final melody, she wondered if perhaps the right day had finally arrived. Saturday afternoon arrived beneath a bright winter sky, and the little community plaza slowly filled with neighbors carrying steaming cups of hot chocolate and bundled against the December chill. Children laughed as they gathered around a small decorated evergreen tree, while local musicians tuned their instruments near the modest stage. There were no television cameras, no giant banners, and no expensive production equipment. It felt less like a performance and more like a gathering of people who had simply come together to share an ordinary afternoon. Nathaniel stood quietly near the back of the audience, greeting volunteers instead of taking the front row that had been reserved for him. He wanted this day to belong to the community, not to his reputation. Claire noticed him watching the entrance every few moments, and then she smiled. Amara and Isaiah had arrived. Amara wore the same carefully repaired winter coat, the faded green scarf wrapped neatly around her neck, and the tiny silver music note charm tied gently around her wrist with the worn blue ribbon. Isaiah walked proudly beside her, carrying the weathered wooden box with both hands as though he had been entrusted with the greatest treasure in the world. Several volunteers welcomed the children with warm smiles, offering them hot cocoa before showing them the small piano waiting at the center of the stage. Amara stopped for a moment when she saw the instrument. She reached out carefully, resting her fingertips against the polished wood without saying a word. Nathaniel approached slowly. "Do you like it?" he asked. She smiled softly. "It reminds me of the piano at church where my mother used to practice." Nathaniel nodded. Then today, it belongs to her memory too. A few minutes later, the neighborhood choir finished their final song, and the gentle conversations throughout the plaza slowly faded. There was no formal introduction. Nathaniel had requested only a single sentence from the event host. "Our next guest would simply like to share a song that means everything to her family." Amara took a slow breath before stepping toward the microphone. Isaiah sat proudly in the front row holding the wooden box on his lap, smiling with complete confidence. For a brief moment, Amara closed her eyes, lightly touching the silver charm around her wrist. Then she began to sing. The first notes floated gently across the plaza, rising above the distant sounds of passing trains and the soft wind moving through the evergreen branches. Conversation stopped almost immediately. Parents lowered their coffee cups. Children who had been chasing one another across the square suddenly stood still. Even the musicians waiting backstage quietly lowered their instruments. No one recognized the melody, yet everyone seemed to understand the emotion carried inside it. It was a song filled with hope, gratitude, and quiet courage, the kind of melody that seemed to wrap itself around every listener like a warm blanket on a cold evening. Nathaniel watched the faces in the audience transform one by one. Some smiled without realizing it. Others quietly wiped away tears they had not expected. No one applauded before the final note because no one wanted to interrupt the moment. As the last gentle phrase drifted into the winter sky, an extraordinary silence settled across the entire plaza. It lasted only a few seconds, but it felt timeless. Then, from somewhere near the back of the crowd, one pair of hands began to clap. Another followed. Then another. Within moments, the entire plaza rose to its feet, not to celebrate fame or perfection, but to honor a little girl who had faithfully carried one mother's final song until the world was finally ready to hear it. The applause continued long after the final note had faded into the crisp afternoon air, yet Amara stood quietly beside the piano with the same gentle humility she had carried every evening on the old bench near the train station. She did not bow. She did not wave. Instead, she looked down at the silver music note charm around her wrist and whispered a silent thank you that only she could hear. Isaiah hurried onto the stage and wrapped his arms around his sister, holding the weathered wooden box tightly against his chest. The audience smiled as the little boy proudly declared, "I told you everybody would feel like they were home." Soft laughter spread through the plaza, followed by another round of warm applause. Nathaniel walked slowly toward the stage, not as the host of the event, but simply as a man whose heart had been changed by listening. He waited until the crowd became quiet before speaking. "A few weeks ago, I believed success was measured by what we could build, buy, or accomplish. Then I met a little girl who reminded me that the greatest things we leave behind cannot be purchased. They are shared." He turned toward Amara with a grateful smile. "Your mother gave this world a beautiful gift. You made sure it was never forgotten." Amara lowered her eyes, overwhelmed by the kindness in his words. Nathaniel reached into his coat pocket and unfolded a single envelope. "I would like to make a promise today," he continued, "not only to Amara and Isaiah, but to every child who has a dream that deserves a chance to grow." He explained that his foundation would establish the Evelyn Johnson Music Scholarship, providing voice lessons, instruments, music education, and performance opportunities for children whose families could not otherwise afford them. He also announced that trusted family support professionals would help Amara and Isaiah move into safe housing while preserving the stability, dignity, and care they deserved, ensuring every decision placed their well-being first. The audience erupted into heartfelt applause once more, but Nathaniel noticed that Amara's attention remained fixed on the weathered wooden box. She carefully opened it and removed the handwritten sheet music. With both hands, she offered the pages to Nathaniel. "My mother always believed songs become stronger when people protect them together," she said softly. "Would you help me keep hers alive?" Nathaniel accepted the music with extraordinary care, as though it were the most valuable document he had ever held. "I promise," he answered, "not because I own it, but because it belongs to everyone who still believes kindness matters." Months passed, and spring slowly replaced the long Chicago winter. The neighborhood plaza filled once again with flowers instead of snow. Children played beside the fountain where hurried strangers had once walked past without noticing a quiet little girl singing to an empty bench. Inside a nearby community arts center, laughter and music echoed through newly opened classrooms funded by the Evelyn Johnson Music Scholarship. Amara attended school again, continued her music lessons, and visited the center each week to encourage younger children who were just beginning to find their own voices. Isaiah proudly filled notebook after notebook with drawings, each one brighter than the last. One afternoon, Nathaniel quietly slipped into the back row as Amara rehearsed with a small youth choir. She still wore the faded green scarf on cool days, and the silver music note charm remained tied around her wrist. Some treasures, she believed, should never be replaced. As her familiar melody floated gently through the room once more, Nathaniel realized that he had not rescued a forgotten song. A brave little girl had rescued something far more precious inside him, proving that the richest life is not measured by the fortune a person earns, but by the hope they choose to pass on to someone else.